and he would not willingly serve him. In such a circumstance, if the two races do not blend, one or the other is doomed. 2. The Orange Man. The outstanding characteristic of this race was their peculiar urge to build anything and everything, even to the piling up of vast mounds of stone, just to see which tribe could build the largest mound. Though they were not a progressive people, they profited much from the schools of the prince, and sent delegates there for instruction. The Orange race was the first to follow the coastline southward toward Africa as the Mediterranean Sea withdrew to the west, but they never secured a favorable footing in Africa, and were wiped out of existence by the later arriving Green race. Before the end came, this people lost much cultural and spiritual ground, but there was a great revival of higher living as a result of the wise leadership of Porshunta, the mastermind of this unfortunate race, who ministered to them when their headquarters was at Armageddon some 300,000 years ago. The last great struggle between the Orange and the Green men occurred in the region of the lower Nile Valley in Egypt. This long drawn-out battle was waged for almost 100 years, and at its close very few of the Orange race were left alive. The shattered remnants of these people were absorbed by the Green and by the later arriving Indigo men. But as a race, the Orange man ceased to exist about 100,000 years ago. 3. The Yellow Man. The primitive yellow tribes were the first to abandon the chase, establish settled communities, and develop a home life based on agriculture. Intellectually, they were somewhat inferior to the red man, but socially and collectively they proved themselves superior to all of the Sangic peoples in the matter of fostering racial civilization. Because they developed a fraternal spirit, the various tribes learning to live together in relative peace, they were able to drive the red race before them as they gradually expanded into Asia. They traveled far from the influences of the spiritual headquarters of the world, and drifted into great darkness following the Caligastia apostasy. But there occurred one brilliant age among this people, when Singlangton, about 100,000 years ago, assumed the leadership of these tribes and proclaimed the worship of the One Truth. The survival of comparatively large numbers of the yellow race is due to their intertribal peacefulness. From the days of Singlangton to the times of modern China, the yellow race has been numbered among the more peaceful of the nations of Urantia. This race received a small but potent legacy of the later imported Adamic stock. 4. The Green Man. The Green race was one of the less able groups of primitive men, and they were greatly weakened by extensive migrations in different directions. Before their dispersion, these tribes experienced a great revival of culture under the leadership of Fontad, some 350,000 years ago. The Green race split into 3 major divisions. The northern tribes were subdued, enslaved, and absorbed by the yellow and blue races. The eastern group were amalgamated with the Indian peoples of those days, and remnants still persist among them. The southern nation entered Africa, where they destroyed their almost equally inferior Orange cousins. In many ways, both groups were evenly matched in this struggle, since each carried strains of the giant order, many of their leaders being 8 and 9 feet in height. These giant strains of the Green Man were mostly confined to this southern or Egyptian nation. The remnants of the victorious Green Men were subsequently absorbed by the Indigo race, the last of the colored peoples to develop and emigrate from the original Sangic center of race dispersion. 5. The Blue Man. The Blue Men were a great people. They early invented the spear and subsequently worked out the rudiments of many of the arts of modern civilization. The Blue Man had the brain power of the Red Man, associated with the soul and sentiment of the Yellow Man. The Adamic descendants preferred them to all of the later persisting colored races. The early Blue Men were responsive to the persuasions of the teachers of Prince Caligastia's staff, and were thrown into great confusion by the subsequent perverted teachings of those traitorous leaders. Like other primitive races, they never fully recovered from the turmoil produced by the Caligastia betrayal, nor did they ever completely overcome their tendency to fight among themselves. About 500 years after Caligastia's downfall, a widespread revival of learning and religion of a primitive sort, but nonetheless real and beneficial, occurred. Orlandolf became a great leader among the blue race, and led many of the tribes back to the worship of the true God under the name of the Supreme Chief. This was the greatest advance of the blue man until those later times when this race was so greatly upstepped by the admixture of the Adamic stock. The European researches and explorations of the Old Stone Age have largely to do with unearthing the tools, bones, and art craft of these ancient blue men, for they persisted in Europe until recent times. The so-called white races of Urantia are the descendants of these blue men, as they were first modified by slight admixture with yellow and red, and as they were later greatly upstepped by assimilating the greater portion of the violet race. 6. The Indigo race. As the red men were the most advanced of all the Sangic peoples, so the black men were the least progressive. They were the last to migrate from their highland homes. They journeyed to Africa, taking possession of the continent, and have ever since remained there, except when they have been forcibly taken away, from age to age, as slaves. Isolated in Africa, the indigo peoples, like the red man, received little or none of the race elevation which would have been derived from the infusion of the Adamic stock. Alone in Africa, the indigo race made little advancement until the days of Orvanon, when they experienced a great spiritual awakening. While they later almost entirely forgot the God of gods proclaimed by Orvanon, they did not entirely lose the desire to worship the unknown. At least they maintained a form of worship up to a few thousand years ago. Notwithstanding their backwardness, these indigo peoples have exactly the same standing before the celestial powers as any other earthly race. These were the ages of intense struggles between the various races, but near the headquarters of the planetary prince, the more enlightened and more recently taught groups lived together in comparative harmony, though no great cultural conquest of the world races had been achieved up to the time of the serious disruption of this regime by the outbreak of the Lucifer Rebellion. From time to time, all of these different peoples experienced cultural and spiritual revivals. Monsant was a great teacher of the post-planetary prince days, but mention is made only of those outstanding leaders and teachers who markedly influenced and inspired a whole race. With the passing of time, many lesser teachers arose in different regions, and in the aggregate they contributed much to the sum total of those saving influences which prevented the total collapse of cultural civilization, especially during the long and dark ages between the Caligastia Rebellion and the arrival of Adam. There are many good and sufficient reasons for the plan of evolving either 3 or 6 colored races on the worlds of space. Though Urantia mortals may not be in a position fully to appreciate all of these reasons, we would call attention to the following. 1. Variety is indispensable to opportunity for the wide functioning of natural selection, differential survival of superior strains. 2. Stronger and better races are to be had from the interbreeding of diverse peoples when these different races are carriers of superior inheritance factors. And the Urantia races would have benefited by such an early amalgamation, provided such a conjoined people could have been subsequently effectively upstepped by a thoroughgoing admixture with the superior Adamic stock. The attempt to execute such an experiment on Urantia under present racial conditions would be highly disastrous. 3. Competition is healthfully stimulated by diversification of races. 4. Differences in status of the races and of groups within each race are essential to the development of human tolerance and altruism. 5. Homogeneity of the human race is not desirable until the peoples of an evolving world attain comparatively high levels of spiritual development. 7. Dispersion of the colored races. When the colored descendants of the Sangic family began to multiply, and as they sought opportunity for expansion into adjacent territory, the 5th glacier, the 3rd of geologic count, was well advanced on its southern drift over Europe and Asia. These early colored races were extraordinarily tested by the rigors and hardships of the glacial age of their origin. This glacier was so extensive in Asia that for thousands